The digital clock above the emergency room doors read 11:47 p.m. When Lee Yuna felt the familiar ice settling in her chest, she pressed her back against the corridor wall, watching through reinforced glass as medical staff swarmed around Kang Minho's convulsing form on the gurney. The heart monitor's steady rhythm had become erratic 30 seconds ago, right on schedule, 13 minutes. That's all she ever got between the crisis and the ending she couldn't prevent. "It's her again," whispered Mrs. Cho from the waiting area, her voice carrying the kind of venom that made heads turn. "The midnight jinx. Fourth one in 3 years." Yuna's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, the engagement ring Minho had placed on her finger just hours earlier catching the harsh fluorescent light. He'd proposed at dinner, laughing when she'd tried to warn him about getting too close, about the pattern that followed her like a shadow. "Love is stronger than superstition," he'd said, his eyes bright with the kind of hope she'd learned to fear. "My nephew worked with one of them," another voice joined the chorus of whispers. "Said they all get sick at exactly the same time, 11:47 p.m., like someone's running a timer on their lives." The accusations weren't new, but they still cut like fresh wounds. Yuna had stopped trying to defend herself months ago, when the second death had turned whispers into open hostility. What could she say? That she didn't understand it either? That she'd tried everything, staying away from men, moving to different neighborhoods, even considering leaving Seoul entirely. But somehow, inevitably, someone would get close enough to care, and the countdown would begin? Through the glass, she watched Dr. Kim inject something into Minho's IV line while nurses checked his vitals with increasing urgency. His face was pale, peaceful in a way that reminded her of the others. Jal, Hyun, who'd coded during what should have been routine surgery. Sunwoo, whose allergic reaction had come out of nowhere. Hyunwoo, whose stroke at 28 had baffled every specialist they'd consulted. "Fourth one in 3 years," Mrs. Cho repeated, her voice rising with righteous anger. "Always the same pattern. They get close to her, then exactly at midnight." She made a cutting gesture across her throat. Mr. Park, whose son had been one of the earlier victims, stood up from his chair with the careful movement of someone carrying unbearable grief. "My boy was healthy until he met you," he said, his voice carrying across the waiting room like a judgment. "What kind of demon steals men's lives at midnight?" Yuna forced herself to meet his eyes, seeing her own reflection in his pain. I never wanted this to happen." "Jinx!" The word came from somewhere in the crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the familiar scene playing out in the emergency room. "Cursed woman! Monster!" The accusations hit her like physical blows, each one driving her deeper into the corner where she'd learned to hide when the world decided she was the villain in everyone else's tragedy. She wanted to scream that she was as much a victim as they were, that she'd lost 4 men she'd genuinely cared about, that the pattern terrified her more than it terrified them. But the words died in her throat, choked by the terrible certainty that maybe they were right. 11:58 p.m. Through the glass, she could see the medical team's movements becoming more frantic. Dr. Kim was calling for additional medication while a nurse prepared the defibrillator. Minho's body looked small and fragile under the harsh lights, nothing like the confident architect who'd spent the morning showing her blueprints for their dream house. "Please," Yuna whispered, pressing her palms against the cold glass. "Please, not him too. He believed love was stronger than this. He was wrong, wasn't he?" The heart monitor's beeping became irregular, then desperate. 11:59 p.m. Yuna closed her eyes, unable to watch but knowing exactly what would happen next. She'd seen this scene 4 times before, memorized every detail of how hope transformed into medical emergency, how love became loss in the space between one midnight and the next. The clock above the doors changed to 12 a.m. The steady beep of the heart monitor became a single, unending tone that seemed to fill the entire hospital with its finality. Midnight. Always midnight. Behind her, the crowd's whispers exploded into open accusations. "Murderer! Stay away from our sons! Someone should do something about her before she kills again." Yuna stumbled toward the exit, not bothering to argue or defend herself. What defense could she possibly offer? That she genuinely loved each of them? That their deaths hurt her as much as they hurt the families left behind? That she'd spent 3 years trying to understand why men she cared about died at precisely midnight, leaving her more isolated with each loss. The automatic doors slid open, releasing her into Seoul's neon-soaked night. Rain had begun to fall, turning the city's lights into watercolor smears across wet pavement. She walked without direction, her heels clicking against concrete in a rhythm that reminded her of the heart monitor's final moments. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, populated only by late-night workers heading home and couples enjoying the kind of casual intimacy Yuna had learned to envy from a distance. A young woman laughed at something her boyfriend whispered, their fingers intertwined as they shared an umbrella. Yuna looked away, the sight too painful to bear. "Maybe they're right," she said to the empty street, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Maybe I am poison disguised as a woman. Maybe the kindest thing I can do is disappear." Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Saw the news? Are you okay?" But how could she explain that okay was a concept that had died with her first boyfriend 3 years ago? That she'd become a stranger to herself, afraid to feel anything deeper than surface-level attraction, because caring meant counting down to another midnight, another funeral, another crowd of people who looked at her like she was personally responsible for death itself. By the time she reached her small apartment in Mapo-gu, the engagement ring felt like a weight she could no longer carry. She slipped it off her finger and placed it on the kitchen table next to the others, simple bands that represented promises that had died at midnight, dreams that had lasted exactly 13 minutes past 11:47 p.m. Tomorrow there would be another funeral to avoid, another family's grief to carry, another layer of isolation to wrap around herself like armor. But tonight, in the silence of her empty apartment, Yuna allowed herself to grieve not just for Minho, but for the woman she'd been before the pattern started, before she'd learned to measure love in 13-minute intervals, before midnight became the most terrifying time of day. Detective Park Hyun-woo's desk looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Red string connected photographs of 4 young men to a timeline marked with exact death times, prescription records, and autopsy reports that made no logical sense when viewed together. He'd been staring at the evidence for 3 hours, coffee growing cold as he tried to find the pattern that would explain how 4 healthy men had died at precisely midnight after developing sudden medical crises at exactly 11:47 p.m. 20 years of police work, he muttered to Dr. Han Soo-jin as she entered his office carrying another stack of medical files. "And I've never seen natural deaths follow schedules like this. It's like someone's running a timer." Soo-jin settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression carrying the focused intensity she reserved for cases that challenged everything she thought she knew about medicine. "Natural being the operative word," she replied, spreading the latest autopsy results across his organized chaos. What if someone's making them look natural? The partnership between Park and Soo-jin had formed organically when the 4th death, Minho's, had crossed both their desks within hours. Park had been tracking what media dubbed Midnight Death Syndrome as a potential serial killer case, while Soo-jin had been consulting on the medical impossibilities that kept appearing in the autopsy reports. "Look at this," Soo-jin said, pointing to a toxicology report. Kang Min-ho's blood showed traces of an experimental anxiety medication, same compound we found in Kim Jae-hyun's system 3 months ago. Park leaned forward, his detective instincts finally finding something concrete to latch onto. "Prescribed by whom?" "That's where it gets interesting." Soo-jin pulled out prescription records for all 4 victims. "Dr. Choi Jaemin. He's been treating Lee Yuna for what he calls supernatural trauma syndrome for the past 2 years. And he prescribed medication to her boyfriends? Anxiety medication, supposedly to help them cope with the stress of dating someone with Yuna's reputation." Soo-jin's voice carried a skepticism that made Park's suspicions crystallize into certainty. The more they dug into Dr. Choi's practice, the more unsettling the picture became. His specialty was treating people who believed they were experiencing supernatural phenomena, but his methods seemed designed to reinforce those beliefs rather than challenge them. His office, located in an upscale medical building in Gangnam, projected an image of clinical respectability that felt performative rather than authentic. We need to talk to him, Park decided. And we need to talk to Yuna again, but this time with different questions. Their first interview with Yuna had been standard procedure, establishing timeline, asking about the victim's mental states, looking for obvious connections. But now, armed with evidence of systematic medication, they needed to understand how deeply the manipulation ran. They found Dr. Choi in his office during evening hours, surrounded by the kind of sterile perfection that made both investigators uncomfortable. Diplomas covered one wall in an arrangement too precise to be natural, while his bookshelf displayed texts on psychology and pharmacology with suspicious emphasis on experimental treatments. Dr. Choi, Park began, settling into a chair that was positioned at exactly the right angle to make visitors feel scrutinized. We need to discuss your treatment of Lee Yuna and your prescriptions to her romantic partners. Choi's smile was practiced, but didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific treatments. However, I can say that supernatural trauma syndrome is a fascinating area of study. Supernatural trauma syndrome, Sujin repeated flatly. Is that a recognized diagnosis? It's the emerging field. People who believe they're experiencing impossible phenomena require specialized care. Miss Yuna, for instance, has convinced herself that she's cursed, that her presence causes death. My role is to help her process these beliefs in healthy ways. By prescribing experimental anxiety medication to the men she dates? Park's voice carried the edge that appeared when he sensed someone was trying to manipulate him. The medication helps them cope with the social pressure of dating someone with such a challenging reputation. The stress of being associated with the midnight jinx can be quite severe. Sujin leaned forward, her medical training allowing her to spot the holes in his explanation. Dr. Choi, these medications have very specific interaction profiles. Combined with elevated stress hormones, they can cause catastrophic medical events. Did you inform the patients of these risks? For the first time, Choi's composure flickered. All medications carry risks. Informed consent is always obtained. Informed consent for medication that becomes lethal when combined with the exact stress conditions you knew these men would experience? Park stood up, his detective instincts screaming that they'd found their killer. That sounds less like treatment and more like premeditated murder. Their second interview with Na took place in the police station's victim services room, designed to be non-threatening but official enough to convey the seriousness of the situation. Yuna entered looking like someone who'd given up expecting good news, her movements carrying the careful precision of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Miss Lee, Sujin began gently, we need to ask you about Dr. Choi's treatment methods, specifically about medication he may have prescribed to the men you were dating. Yuna's confusion seemed genuine. He mentioned that dating me was stressful for them, that he could provide support if they needed it. But I thought he meant therapy sessions. He was prescribing anxiety medication, Park explained, watching her face carefully for signs of complicity. Medication that becomes dangerous when combined with elevated stress hormones. The color drained from Yuna's face as the implications became clear. You're saying someone's been murdering them? But why make me think I'm cursed? Because if you believe you're the cause, you'll isolate yourself, Sujin said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that made people trust her with their deepest fears. No witnesses, no one to notice the pattern except you, and you've been conditioned to blame yourself rather than look for external causes. Yuna stared at them for a long moment, her hands trembling as 3 years of constructed reality began to crumble. I've spent every day since Jaehyun died thinking I was a monster. You're telling me I was just convenient? You were targeted, Park corrected. Someone wanted you isolated and convinced of your own toxicity. The question is why? As Yuna broke down, finally allowing herself to feel the grief she'd been carrying without the added weight of self-blame, Park and Sujin exchanged looks that confirmed they were dealing with something more complex than simple serial killing. The precision of the timing, the sophistication of the method, the psychological manipulation, it all suggested an organization with resources and long-term planning capabilities. There's something else, Sujin said once Yuna had composed herself enough to continue. Dr. Choi's research funding comes from a private foundation that's been studying what they call anomalous psychological phenomena for decades. This isn't just about you, Yuna. This is about something much larger. The investigation had started as an attempt to solve 4 impossible deaths, but as evidence mounted of systematic manipulation designed to convince a young woman that she was cursed, Park and Sujin realized they'd stumbled onto something that challenged their understanding of how far people would go to control others' perception of reality. The question we need to answer now, Park said as they prepared to dig deeper into the Foundation's activities, is what makes Yuna so important that someone would kill 4 innocent men just to keep her isolated and convinced she's dangerous. The answer, they suspected, would reveal that the midnight deaths were just the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing truth. The interrogation room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Dr. Choi's face as he sat across from Detective Park and Dr. Sujin, his earlier composure completely shattered. The evidence spread across the metal table between them. Prescription records, death certificates, and bank statements showing payments from something called the Meridian Research Foundation had stripped away his professional facade to reveal something far more disturbing underneath. "Let's try this again," Park said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd seen too many victims. 4 healthy young men are dead because of medications you prescribed. Explain that. Choi's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water cup, a gesture so at odds with his earlier clinical detachment that it made Sujin lean forward with renewed attention. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he said finally. "Yuna represents the perfect subject, someone with genuine spiritual sensitivity being taught to distrust her own perceptions." "You murdered 4 innocent people for research?" Park's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, unable to contain his disgust. "I preserved a valuable psychological construct." Choi's voice took on the passionate tone of someone defending their life's work. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone who can genuinely sense supernatural phenomena? Most people claiming spiritual experiences are delusional or attention-seeking. But Yuna, she's authentic." Sujin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. "You're saying she actually has supernatural abilities?" "I'm saying she was born with the capacity to perceive things others can't. My job was to ensure she never learned to trust those perceptions." Choi looked between them with the earnest expression of someone explaining something obvious. "If people like her develop confidence in their abilities, it disrupts carefully maintained social structures." The confession led them to an address in an upscale Gangnam office building, where the Meridian Research Foundation occupied 3 floors behind unmarked doors. The facility looked like any other corporate headquarters from the outside, but inside, the walls were covered with photographs and documentation spanning decades. Surveillance photos of individuals, detailed psychological profiles, and research data that read like something from a dystopian nightmare. Director Kim greeted them in a conference room that overlooked Seoul's skyline, his manner suggesting he'd been expecting their visit. He was younger than they'd anticipated, maybe 45, with the kind of calm authority that came from never having his decisions questioned. Dr. Choi was unfortunately indiscreet, he said without preamble, gesturing for them to sit at a polished table surrounded by monitors displaying data they couldn't interpret. "But his work was valuable. We've been studying individuals with anomalous perceptual abilities for over 60 years. "Studying them how?" Sujin asked. Though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "We don't suppress spirituality," Kim replied with the practiced patience of someone who'd given this explanation before. "We channel it into acceptable forms. Organized religion, commercial mysticism, entertainment, these provide safe outlets for spiritual impulses. Independent spiritual insight, however, is dangerous to social stability." Park stared at him in disbelief. "You're talking about mind control." "We're talking about maintaining the delicate balance between human need for meaning and societal order." Kim touched something on his tablet, and the monitors around them came alive with images. Protests being dispersed, social movements collapsing, individuals who'd once been charismatic leaders now living quiet, unremarkable lives. People who can genuinely perceive hidden truths and inspire others to trust their own insights represent a threat to established systems. And Yuna? Sujin's medical training was screaming at her to document everything, to find some way to expose this systematic abuse. Yuna is special. In her original lifetime, she was a shaman who helped people recognize when they were being manipulated by those in power. She had the ability to see through deceptions and teach others to do the same. We've been tracking her reincarnations for centuries, ensuring each lifetime ends before she can fully awaken to her potential. The casual way he discussed centuries of systematic murder made Park's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. You've been killing the same person over and over? Until this lifetime, yes. Early deaths that appeared natural, disease, accidents, violence that could be attributed to social unrest. But this time, we decided to try a different approach. Keep her alive, but psychologically damaged, convinced she's dangerous to anyone who gets close. Meanwhile, across Seoul in her small apartment, Yuna was experiencing something that 3 years of conditioning hadn't prepared her for. At 3 a.m., sitting alone in her kitchen with tea growing cold, she felt a presence approaching, not physically, but with the kind of certainty that bypassed rational thought entirely. I can feel someone coming, she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible. Someone who's been looking for me for a very long time. But how is that possible? The sensation was unlike anything Dr. Choi had taught her to categorize as trauma response or stress-induced hallucination. This felt like recognition, like some part of her soul was responding to a call she'd been waiting her entire life to hear. By morning, the feeling had intensified to the point where she couldn't stay in her apartment. She found herself walking through Seoul's streets without destination, following an instinct that seemed to know where she needed to be. The 24-hour cafe in Hongdae wasn't a place she'd ever visited, but when she saw it through the rain-streaked windows, something in her chest said, here. She was sitting at a corner table, watching water cascade down glass, when someone slid into the seat across from her. The moment she looked up, the world shifted on its axis. You're not cursed, Yuna, he said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place and an authority that made her forget to breathe. You're being suppressed. He was beautiful in a way that belonged in historical paintings rather than modern Seoul. Sharp features that suggested aristocratic bloodlines, dark eyes that held depths implying centuries of accumulated experience, and a stillness that spoke of someone who'd learned patience through endless waiting. I'm sorry, do I know you? She asked, though something in her chest was responding to his presence in ways that defied explanation. Not yet, he replied, extending his hand with old-fashioned courtesy that felt familiar despite being foreign. But you knew me once, deeply enough that they've spent centuries keeping us apart. They? The people who convinced you that you're dangerous, the ones who've been murdering anyone you get close to. His expression carried grief, refined by time but never dulled. My name is Kang Ji-hoon, though that's not what I was called when we first met. Yuna stared at him, wondering if the stress of recent revelations had finally broken her grip on reality. You're saying you know about the midnight deaths? I'm saying I've been alive for over 500 years, and I've been finding you in different lifetimes for most of that time. He pulled out his phone, swiping through, images that made her world tilt sideways. Every time you reincarnate, something prevents us from connecting. This lifetime, they tried manufactured trauma instead of early death. The photographs showed him unchanged across decades, standing beside different women who all shared her basic features, her expressions, her way of holding herself. The dates ranged from the 1920s to the 1990s, an impossible timeline that should have been easy to dismiss as elaborate forgery. But Yuna found herself believing, not because of the evidence, but because of the way her soul recognized his presence, the way something long dormant was stirring to life in response to his voice. This is insane, she said, though her protest lacked conviction. You're saying I'm, reincarnated? I'm saying you're powerful enough that entire organizations dedicate resources to keeping you confused about your own nature. He leaned forward, and she caught a scent like winter pine and old books that triggered memories she didn't consciously possess. The midnight deaths aren't random, and they're not a curse. They're a barrier, designed to prevent you from forming the kind of deep emotional bond that might awaken memories you're supposed to have forgotten. Memories of what? Of the life where we loved each other so completely that even death couldn't separate us permanently. The Buddhist temple in Jogyesa was nearly empty at dawn, morning light filtering through ancient wooden beams, while incense smoke created ethereal patterns in the still air. Ji-hoon had brought Yuna here without explanation, simply saying that some memories required the right atmosphere to surface. As they walked through the courtyard where monks were beginning their morning prayers, something in Yuna's chest began to resonate with frequencies she'd forgotten she could hear. "I've been here before," she said denly, stopping beside a large bronze bell whose surface was worn smooth by centuries of use. "Not in this lifetime, but I remember the sound of these bells." Ji-hoon watched her with the careful attention of someone who'd witnessed this awakening process before, though never successfully. "You rang them every morning for 3 years," he said softly. "Said the vibration helped you see through deceptions. That truth resonated at a different frequency than lies." The memory that surfaced wasn't visual, but emotional. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of understanding her place in a larger cosmic order. Yuna pressed her palm against the bell's surface and felt tears she couldn't explain streaming down her face. "I was happy here," she whispered. "I was useful." "You were revolutionary," Ji-hoon corrected, his voice carrying pride that spanned centuries. "People came to you not just for spiritual guidance, but for help recognizing when they were being manipulated by those in power. You had the gift of helping others trust their own perceptions instead of accepting authoritative interpretations of their experiences." Over the following days, Ji-hoon guided her through Seoul with the expertise of someone who'd been mapping significant locations across multiple lifetimes. Each place triggered fragments of memory, not complete scenes, but emotional echoes that gradually built into a coherent sense of who she'd been before the systematic suppression began. The hillside overlooking the Han River, where cherry blossoms fell like snow in the spring breeze, brought back memories of quiet conversations about the nature of spiritual authority and the danger of allowing others to define your relationship with the divine. "In your first lifetime, you were a shaman who helped people recognize when they were being manipulated by those in power," Ji-hoon explained as they sat beneath flowering trees that had somehow survived Seoul's rapid modernization. "And that made me dangerous." "That made you revolutionary. People who trust their own spiritual insights can't be controlled through manufactured fear." He touched her hand, the contact sending recognition through her entire nervous system. "You taught them that spiritual truth comes from within, not from institutions that profit from keeping people dependent and confused." The moment when soul-deep familiarity overwhelmed rational doubt came unexpectedly as they were walking through Myeongdong's crowded streets. Ji-hoon had been explaining something about the organization's methods when he made a gesture, running his hand through his hair in a way that bypassed her conscious mind and went straight to some deeper recognition center. Without thinking, Yuna reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing features that felt familiar despite being impossible. "I know you," she said, her voice carrying wonder and certainty in equal measure. "Not your name, not your story, but I know how you love. I know the sound you make when you're trying not to cry." Ji-hoon closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, his composure finally cracking to reveal the vulnerability he'd carried for 5 centuries. "I've waited 500 years for you to look at me like that again." That evening, in her small apartment surrounded by historical documents Ji-hoon had collected across lifetimes, the full scope of their tragedy became clear. The papers spread across her kitchen table told the story of systematic early deaths spanning centuries. Each reincarnation cut short just as she began to awaken to her true nature. "I found you in 1892, Ji-hoon said, his voice steady despite the pain etched in his expression. "You died of tuberculosis at 19, just as you were beginning to help other women recognize their own spiritual authority. 1934, factory accident at 21, you'd been organizing workers, teaching them to trust their own sense of when they were being exploited rather than accepting management's explanations. 1967, car crash at 23. You were part of the student movement, helping people see through government propaganda. Yuna studied the death certificates, each one representing a life cut short, potential unrealized, love interrupted. Always young, always before you could remember what you're capable of, Ji-hoon finished. This is the first lifetime they've let you live long enough to potentially awaken, and even then, they tried to break you psychologically instead of killing you outright. As days passed and more memories surfaced, Yuna began experiencing changes that went beyond recovered recollections. Her perception was shifting, allowing her to sense things she'd been conditioned to ignore or dismiss. The ability Dr. Choi had tried so hard to suppress was finally beginning to emerge despite decades of systematic interference. I can feel what people really want now, she told Ji-hoon as they sat in a cafe where she'd noticed the barista's genuine kindness beneath his professional smile, where she could sense which customers were lonely and which were simply busy. Dr. Choi never wanted to help me. He wanted to study me like a specimen. That's just the beginning, Ji-hoon said, watching her with the careful attention of someone documenting a miracle. Your original gift was helping others trust their own perceptions instead of accepting authoritative interpretations. You could see through systemic deceptions and teach others to do the same. The awakening wasn't without its difficulties. Yuna found herself overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of recovered memories, grieving not just for the current lifetimes, losses, but for centuries of interrupted connections, truncated possibilities, loves that had been systematically prevented from reaching their full potential. How do you bear it? She asked Ji-hoon one evening as they walked along the Han River, the city's lights reflecting on water that had witnessed their story across multiple incarnations. Remembering everything, losing me over and over? By believing that love this deep serves a purpose, he replied, stopping to face her completely. We're not just romantic partners, Yuna. We're part of something larger. A spiritual revolution that threatens systems built on keeping people disconnected from their own inner wisdom. As her abilities continued to strengthen, Yuna began to understand why the organization had invested so much in keeping her suppressed. She wasn't just someone who could see through deceptions. She was someone who could teach others to recognize their own spiritual authority, to trust their perceptions even when those perceptions challenged established power structures. They're afraid, she realized one morning as she felt the full extent of her awakening awareness. Not just of what I can do, but of what I can help others remember about themselves. The woman who'd spent 3 years believing she was cursed was discovering that she was actually blessed with abilities so powerful that entire organizations had dedicated centuries to keeping her from realizing her own potential. And for the first time since the midnight deaths began, Yuna was beginning to understand that her greatest power wasn't supernatural. It was the ability to help others trust themselves in a world designed to make self-trust dangerous. Director Kim's office felt like a monument to systematic control, its walls lined with centuries of documentation that represented lives derailed, spiritual awakenings suppressed, and human and potential carefully managed for the benefit of established power structures. As Yuna stood across from his polished desk, flanked by Detective Park, Dr. Sujin, and Ji-hoon, she felt the weight of every soul who'd been silenced by the organization's methodical interference. You think exposing us will free people? Kim asked, his voice carrying the condescending patience of someone who'd spent decades convinced of his own necessity. We provide necessary structure. Without managed spiritual beliefs, society would collapse into chaos. Yuna looked at him with eyes that could now see through the elaborate justifications he'd constructed for systematic spiritual suppression. You provide manufactured confusion so people don't trust their own insights, she replied, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't existed 3 months ago. You profit from keeping people disconnected from their own spiritual truth. We provide stability, Kim insisted, touching his tablet to display charts showing social unrest statistics and economic disruption data. Your kind represents dangerous unpredictability. When people start trusting their own spiritual perceptions over established authorities, social order breaks down. Whose social order? Jihoon asked quietly, his centuries of experience allowing him to see patterns that others missed. The order that benefits from people accepting explanations that don't serve them? The stability that requires keeping entire populations confused about their own spiritual capacity? The evidence they'd compiled over weeks of investigation filled boxes that Park's team had transported to the office. Documentation of systematic campaigns against spiritually sensitive individuals spanning decades. Financial records showing government and corporate funding for spiritual suppression programs, and personal files on hundreds of people who'd be targeted for having authentic mystical experiences. The midnight deaths were just the beginning, Sujin said, reviewing medical records that showed patterns of induced spiritual crisis across multiple demographics. You've been systematically targeting anyone who might help others develop genuine spiritual discernment. Kim's composure finally showed cracks as he realized the scope of what they'd uncovered. You have no idea what forces you're playing with. Unrestricted spiritual awakening leads to social fragmentation, economic disruption, the collapse of institutions that maintain civilization. It leads to people making choices based on their own authentic spiritual insights rather than accepting authoritative interpretations designed to keep them compliant, Yuna corrected, feeling the full power of her awakened abilities flowing through her voice. And yes, that terrifies anyone whose authority depends on spiritual confusion. The press conference that followed was unlike anything Seoul's media had ever witnessed. The ballroom of the Lotte Hotel was packed with journalists, government officials, religious leaders, and academics who'd come expecting to debunk another conspiracy theory, but found themselves confronting evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about spiritual experience and social control. Yuna stood at the podium wearing a simple white dress that seemed to radiate calm authority, her presence commanding attention in ways that had nothing to do with stage presence and everything to do with authentic spiritual power finally allowed to manifest. How do you respond to claims that you're delusional? Asked a reporter from a major network, his question carrying the skeptical edge that usually preceded character assassination. I respond by demonstrating that spiritual insight is real and valuable, Yuna replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the room without amplification, that people can learn to distinguish between authentic experiences and manufactured ones. She looked directly at Director Kim, who was sitting in the audience with several associates, their carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under scrutiny. Some of you are terrified that if people trust their own perceptions, they'll stop accepting systems designed to exploit their confusion, she continued, her awakened abilities allowing her to see the fear beneath their authoritative facades. You've built entire careers on managing others' spiritual experiences, on being the arbiters of what's real and what's delusion. The demonstration that followed changed everything. Yuna began describing the true motivations and hidden fears of various audience members, not as a parlor trick, but as evidence that genuine spiritual perception was possible and valuable. She identified journalists who'd come to debunk her, but were secretly seeking spiritual truth themselves, government officials who were terrified of losing control over public perception, and religious leaders who'd forgotten that their authority was supposed to serve rather than suppress authentic spiritual experience. The age of managing people's spiritual experiences without their consent is over, she declared, her words carrying the weight of centuries of suppressed truth finally finding voice. The aftermath was swift and transformative. Kim's organization was exposed not just as a research facility, but as part of a global network dedicated to preventing spiritual awakening through systematic manipulation. The evidence Yuna's team had compiled sparked investigations in multiple countries, leading to the discovery of similar operations designed to keep people disconnected from their own spiritual authority. But the real victory wasn't the organization's downfall, it was the public's response. Instead of dismissing Yuna's claims as delusion, people began sharing their own experiences of authentic spiritual insight, of times when they'd been discouraged from trusting their own perceptions, of institutions that seemed designed to keep them spiritually dependent rather than empowered. We're not here to destroy existing structures, Ji-hoon explained during a follow-up interview. We're here to give people enough information to make their own choices about what to believe, what to trust, and how to develop their own relationship with spiritual truth. The wedding took place at dawn on the anniversary of Minho's death, a deliberate choice that transformed the date from a marker of tragedy into a celebration of triumph over manufactured curses. The ceremony was held at the same Buddhist temple where Yuna had begun recovering her memories, surrounded by people who'd been liberated from various forms of spiritual suppression. "Someone once convinced me that my spiritual sensitivity was dangerous," Yuna said during her wedding speech, looking out at faces that reflected different stages of spiritual awakening. "But the person standing beside me taught me that the only dangerous thing about spiritual insight is how threatening it is to people who profit from others' confusion." Jihoon's response was simple but profound. Love that survives 500 years of systematic interference isn't just romance. It's proof that some connections transcend any attempt to break them. 5 years later, the Foundation for Authentic Spiritual Development occupied a converted temple complex in the hills outside Seoul, its grounds filled with people learning to distinguish between genuine spiritual experiences and manufactured ones. Yuna found herself in the role she'd always been meant for, not as a guru or authority figure, but as someone who helped others trust their own spiritual perceptions. "How do I know if my experiences are real or if someone's manipulating me?" asked a young woman during one of the Foundation's weekly workshops, her question echoing concerns that had become common as people began questioning decades of spiritual conditioning. "You learn to trust the difference between fear-based messages that make you feel powerless and authentic insights that help you feel more connected to your own truth," Yuna replied, her answer carrying the wisdom earned through centuries of spiritual suppression and ultimate liberation. Real spiritual insight empowers you to make better choices for yourself and others. Manufactured spiritual experiences usually serve someone else's agenda. The Foundation's work extended far beyond individual healing. They documented and exposed spiritual suppression operations in 17 countries, helped establish legal protections for people experiencing authentic mystical phenomena, and created educational programs that taught spiritual discernment rather than spiritual dependence. That evening, as Yuna and Jihoon sat on their balcony watching the sun set over Seoul's transformed skyline, the city below them buzzed with the energy of people who were learning to trust their own spiritual authority for the first time in generations. "Do you ever regret the lifetimes we lost?" Jihoon asked, his voice carrying the contentment of someone who'd finally achieved what he'd been working toward for centuries. "I regret the suffering," Yuna replied, taking his hand with the easy intimacy of souls who'd found each other across impossible odds. "But every separation taught us something about the value of connection. Maybe we needed 500 years to learn how to build something this strong." Below them, the city's lights began to twinkle on, each one representing someone who was learning to navigate their spiritual life with authentic discernment rather than manufactured confusion. The woman who'd once believed she was cursed had become someone who helped others recognize their own spiritual blessings. "And maybe," Jihoon said, pulling her closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "some loves are worth waiting centuries for." The midnight deaths that had once terrorized Yuna were now remembered as evidence of how far some people would go to prevent spiritual awakening. But more importantly, they'd become proof that love and truth were ultimately stronger than any system designed to suppress them. In the end, the greatest liberation wasn't just Yuna's personal freedom from manufactured curses. It was the collective awakening of a society that had learned to distinguish between authentic spiritual wisdom and the counterfeits designed to keep them spiritually dependent and confused. The woman who'd been told she was toxic to love had become someone who helped others recognize that they were worthy of authentic spiritual connection. And in a world where that lesson was spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, midnight would never again be a time of terror, only a marker of how far they'd all come from the darkness of systematic spiritual suppression. The curse was broken, not through magic, but through the simple, revolutionary act of helping people trust their own spiritual truth. And that, Yuna realized, had been the real power they'd been afraid of all along. From midnight curse to eternal love, Yuna's 500-year romance just proved that some souls are destined to find each other no matter what. If this reincarnation love story had you believing in fate, Smash that subscribe button for more manhwa, where love transcends lifetimes and death itself. Comment your wildest reincarnation theory. Do you think you've loved someone across multiple lives?